22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., over 4 million German troops surge across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Adolf Hitler has unleashed Operation Barbarossa, a campaign he believes will secure the Third Reich's destiny and destroy his greatest ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. What Hitler could not foresee was that this massive gamble would become Nazi Germany's greatest strategic blunder, the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. To understand Operation Barbarossa, we must first understand the twisted ideology that drove Adolf Hitler. His hatred of the Soviet Union was not merely political. It was a virulent combination of anti-communist fanaticism and his obsession with Lebensraum, the living space he believed the German people needed to survive and thrive. In the pages of Mein Kampf, written nearly 2 decades before the invasion, Hitler had already outlined his vision: the destruction of what he called Jewish Bolshevism and the colonization of the vast territories of the East. The fertile plains of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, the minerals of Siberia, all would feed the Germanic Empire he envisioned lasting 1,000 years. The non-aggression pact signed with Stalin in August 1939 was never meant to last. Hitler viewed it as a tactical convenience, buying time while he dealt with the Western democracies. As German and Soviet forces carved up Poland between them, Hitler was already planning the betrayal that would define his war. By the summer of 1940, Hitler's armies had achieved the impossible. Poland had fallen in weeks, Denmark and Norway were occupied, and France, the great military power of Europe, had surrendered in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, battered by the Luftwaffe but defiant behind the English Channel. Yet even as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, Hitler's attention was turning eastward. In December 1940, he issued Directive No. 21, the formal order for Operation Barbarossa. Named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had led the Third Crusade, this would be Hitler's crusade against what Nazi ideology termed the subhuman Slavs and their Bolshevik masters. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. 3 massive army groups would strike simultaneously across an 1,800-mile front, the longest in military history. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would thrust straight at Moscow, the heart of the Soviet state. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would sweep through Ukraine toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The German High Command estimated the campaign would last 8 to 10 weeks. By Christmas 1941, they believed the swastika would fly over the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union would exist only as a memory. But first, Hitler needed to secure his southern flank. In April 1941, German forces swept through Yugoslavia and Greece, crushing both nations in a matter of weeks. The campaign was a military triumph, but it came at a crucial cost. Operation Barbarossa was delayed by 5 vital weeks. As spring turned to summer in 1941, Hitler's war machine prepared for its greatest test. The fate of the Third Reich, indeed the fate of the world, would be decided in the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. At precisely 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion force in human history crossed into Soviet territory. Over 3,800 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, and 4.2 million men from Germany and its allies began what they believed would be the final campaign of their war for European domination. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, perfected in Poland and France, seemed perfectly suited to the vast Russian steppes. Panzer spearheads punched through Soviet defenses while the Luftwaffe swept the skies clear of opposition. The initial devastation was beyond even German expectations. Caught completely off guard despite numerous intelligence warnings, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Over 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the first day alone, most of them on the ground before their pilots could even reach them. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had achieved near-total air superiority. Soviet commanders, many of them recent appointments following Stalin's brutal purges of the military leadership, struggled to comprehend the scope of the disaster unfolding before them. The speed of the German advance defied all previous military experience. Army Group Center's panzers covered 400 miles in just 6 days. reaching Minsk and trapping over 300,000 Soviet troops in a massive encirclement. By July 1st, German forces had advanced further into Russia than Napoleon's Grande Armée had reached in 3 months. The cauldron battles that followed were slaughter on an industrial scale. At Białystok-Minsk, Smolensk, and Uman, entire Soviet armies vanished into German prison cages. In the first 3 weeks of the campaign alone, over 600,000 Red Army soldiers were captured, along with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. To the German High Command, watching their forces slice through Soviet defenses like a knife through butter, victory seemed not just probable but inevitable. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, confided to his diary that the campaign was virtually won. By August 1941, the statistics of German success were staggering. Army Group North had reached the outskirts of Leningrad and begun the siege that would last 872 days. Army Group Center had captured Smolensk, just 200 miles from Moscow. Army Group South was racing toward Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Red Army appeared to be in complete collapse, its divisions shattered, its command structure in chaos. Yet beneath the surface of these stunning German victories, problems were already emerging that would prove fatal to Hitler's grand design. The sheer distances involved stretched German supply lines to the breaking point. Trucks and tanks, designed for the highways of Western Europe, broke down on primitive Russian roads that turned to impassable mud with every rain shower. More ominously, despite suffering losses that would have destroyed any Western army, the Red Army continued to fight. New divisions appeared from the depths of the Soviet Union as if materializing from thin air. Equipment that German intelligence had dismissed as inferior, particularly the revolutionary T-34 tank with its sloped armor and superior mobility, began taking a toll on German armor. While the Wehrmacht celebrated its victories in Western Russia, a massive industrial evacuation was taking place behind the Ural Mountains. Entire factories were being dismantled and moved eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. Soviet industry, far from being destroyed, was being preserved and expanded in the depths of Siberia. Joseph Stalin, after his initial paralysis in the face of the invasion, had begun mobilizing resources on a scale that defied German calculations. The Soviet Union's vast population and industrial capacity, grossly underestimated by Nazi intelligence, was being marshaled for a fight to the death. As summer turned to autumn in 1941, the quick victory that Hitler had promised was revealing itself to be an illusion. The Wehrmacht was winning battles but not destroying the Soviet capacity to wage war. Each mile deeper into Russia took the Germans further from their supply bases and closer to a winter for which they were tragically unprepared. August 21, 1941. As Army Group Center's panzers sat within striking distance of Moscow, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would haunt the German war effort forever. Against the unanimous advice of his generals, he ordered the main thrust toward the Soviet capital to halt while forces were diverted south to capture Kiev. The Führer's generals were aghast. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of blitzkrieg warfare, pleaded with Hitler to maintain the momentum toward Moscow. General Franz Halder warned that the delay would give the Soviets precious time to strengthen their defenses. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, argued that Moscow was the nerve center of the Soviet state. Capture it, and the communist government would collapse. But Hitler was obsessed with the agricultural riches of Ukraine and the industrial centers of the Donbass region. Economic considerations, he argued, outweighed purely military objectives. The grain of Ukraine would feed the German people, its coal and steel would arm the Wehrmacht, and its conquest would deny these resources to Stalin. The pause that followed lasted 6 crucial weeks, time that would prove more valuable than all the Ukrainian wheat in the world. The diversion south did achieve spectacular tactical success. In the largest encirclement in military history, German forces trapped over 650,000 Soviet troops around Kiev. The ancient Ukrainian capital fell, along with most of the country's industrial heartland. By any conventional measure, it was a triumph of German arms. But while panzers rolled through the Ukrainian countryside, autumn was advancing in central Russia. Each day of delay was a day closer to the dreaded Russian winter, and each day gave the Soviets more time to prepare the defenses of Moscow. Under the direction of General Georgy Zhukov, the one Soviet commander who had successfully stood up to the Wehrmacht in the border battles with Japan, Moscow was being transformed into a fortress. Anti-tank obstacles sprouted from the earth in concentric rings around the city. Artillery positions were carefully sited to create killing fields for advancing German armor. Most critically, fresh divisions were pouring in from Siberia, released from guard duty against Japan by Soviet intelligence reports that Tokyo would not attack in the north. By the time Hitler finally authorized the resumption of the advance on Moscow in October 1941, the Russian autumn had begun in earnest. Operation Typhoon, as the assault was codenamed, faced not only strengthened Soviet defenses but the beginning of the climatic conditions that had defeated Napoleon 129 years earlier. The autumn rains, which Russians call the Rasputitsa, the time of no roads, turned the primitive Russian countryside into an impassable quagmire. German mechanized units, designed for the autobahns of the Reich, ground to a halt in mud that swallowed tanks up to their turrets. Supply convoys that should have taken hours to reach the front lines now required days. Despite these obstacles, the Wehrmacht's final drive on Moscow achieved initial success. Vyazma and Bryansk fell in massive encirclements that netted another 650,000 Soviet prisoners. By November, German reconnaissance units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed within reach, but victory was an illusion. The German army was exhausted, its equipment breaking down, its supply lines stretched to the snapping point. More critically, the soldiers were still dressed in summer uniforms as temperatures plummeted below freezing. The Wehrmacht's failure to prepare for winter warfare was a catastrophe born of overconfidence. Hitler and his generals had been so certain of quick victory that no serious provision had been made for a winter campaign. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, vehicles wouldn't start in sub-zero temperatures, and weapons froze solid in the bitter cold. German casualties from frostbite began to exceed those from enemy action. Entire divisions became combat ineffective not from Soviet attacks but from the remorseless assault of General Winter, Russia's most reliable ally. While German soldiers shivered in their summer uniforms, the Red Army was preparing for winter warfare. Soviet troops, equipped with proper winter gear and accustomed to the harsh climate, moved through the snow like ghosts. The T-34 tanks, with their wide tracks and diesel engines, continued to function in temperatures that immobilized German armor. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht had come within 20 miles of Moscow, close enough to see the city's lights on a clear night. But they could advance no further. The lightning war had become a winter nightmare, and the Red Army was about to remind the world that the bear had claws. December 6, 1941. As German troops huddled in their frozen foxholes outside Moscow, convinced that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse, Stalin unleashed a surprise that shattered the myth of German invincibility forever. At dawn, across a front stretching hundreds of miles, fresh Siberian divisions launched a massive counteroffensive. These were not the shell-shocked conscripts the Germans had been fighting for months, but elite troops hardened by years of service in the Far East, equipped for winter warfare and burning with determination to drive the invaders from Russian soil. The German army, victorious for 2.5 years across Europe, suddenly found itself in full retreat. Hitler's orders to hold every position at all costs proved impossible to obey as Soviet armor and infantry poured through gaps in the frozen German lines. For the first time in World War II, the Wehrmacht was running, and the world was watching. The retreat quickly threatened to become a rout. German forces, many of them suffering 50% casualties from frostbite alone, abandoned equipment and strong points in their desperate flight westward. Entire divisions dissolved as units became separated in the chaos of winter warfare. By January 1942, German forces had been pushed back over 100 miles from Moscow. The drive that had begun with such confidence and success was ending in humiliation and disaster. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were dead, wounded, missing, or frozen into uselessness. More damaging than the material losses was the psychological impact. The German army's reputation for invincibility, carefully cultivated through 2 years of stunning victories, lay shattered in the Russian snow. If the Wehrmacht could be defeated by subhuman Slavs, then perhaps the Third Reich was not invincible after all. But Adolf Hitler was not ready to acknowledge defeat. Refusing to accept that his grand strategy had failed, he began planning an even more ambitious campaign for 1942. If Moscow could not be taken directly, then Germany would strangle the Soviet Union by seizing its economic lifelines, the oil fields of the Caucasus and the grain of the lower Volga. Operation Blue, launched in June 1942, would split German forces between two divergent objectives: the oil of Baku and a city on the Volga River that bore the Soviet dictator's name, Stalingrad. Stalingrad was not particularly important strategically. It was an industrial city producing tanks and tractors, but its capture would not significantly impact Soviet war production. Its true significance lay in its name and what that name represented to both dictators locked in their death struggle. For Stalin, the city was a symbol of his revolution and his power. For Hitler, it represented the personification of his ideological enemy. The battle that followed would become the most savage urban combat in human history. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought in the rubble of Stalingrad building by building, room by room, sometimes floor by floor. The German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, found itself trapped in a tactical nightmare where their advantages in equipment and training meant nothing. In the ruins of the city, a Russian sniper could kill a German general as easily as a German tank could crush a Soviet infantryman. The battle became a grinding war of attrition that consumed men and material at a horrific rate, while achieving no strategic objective beyond satisfying Hitler's obsession with capturing the city that bore his enemy's name. While the German Sixth Army bled itself white in the ruins of Stalingrad, the flanks of the entire southern offensive were being held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces, Germany's reluctant allies who lacked both the equipment and the motivation of German troops. Soviet intelligence, now vastly improved from the disasters of 1941, identified these weak points and began planning an operation that would dwarf even the Moscow counteroffensive in its scope and ambition. Operation Uranus was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. While the Germans focused on capturing the last few blocks of Stalingrad, massive Soviet armored forces would strike the weak Axis flanks north and south of the city, meeting behind German lines to trap the entire Sixth Army. November 19, 1942. As dawn broke over the snow-covered steppes around Stalingrad, Soviet artillery opened the most concentrated barrage since the beginning of the war. Within hours, the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soviet armor poured through the gap, racing to complete the encirclement. For days later, the trap snapped shut. The German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was completely surrounded in what became known as the Stalingrad Cauldron. Hitler's obsession with a meaningless city had delivered an entire army into Soviet hands. The Stalingrad Cauldron became a frozen hell. Despite Hermann Göring's promises that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, the few transport aircraft that managed to reach the encircled forces could carry only a fraction of what was needed. German soldiers, already weakened by months of urban combat, began starving and freezing in the ruins they had fought so hard to capture. Hitler's orders forbidding any attempt to break out sealed the Sixth Army's fate. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the trapped forces, pleaded for permission to attempt a breakout while his men still had the strength to fight. Hitler's response was to promote Paulus to Field Marshal and remind him that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. On February 2, 1943, the last German resistance in Stalingrad collapsed. Field Marshal Paulus became the first German Field Marshal in history to surrender, leading 90,000 survivors into Soviet captivity. Of the 250,000 men who had been encircled, fewer than 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The disaster at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The aura of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe was gone forever, replaced by the grim reality that Germany was now fighting a war it could not win. Spring 1943. Despite the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler refused to accept that his war in the East was lost. German industry, working with the desperate efficiency of a nation fighting for its life, had produced new wonder weapons, the the massive 60-ton Tiger tank with its virtually impenetrable armor, and the sophisticated Panther with its high-velocity gun that could destroy any Soviet tank at long range. Hitler believed these technological marvels could restore German superiority on the Eastern Front. One final offensive, he convinced himself, would break Soviet resistance and return the initiative to the Wehrmacht. The target was a massive Soviet bulge in the German lines around the city of Kursk. Operation Citadel would be Germany's last great gamble in the East. A massive pincer movement designed to trap and destroy the entire Kursk salient, eliminating over 1 million Soviet troops and restoring German confidence. Over 750,000 German troops, supported by 2,700 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, prepared for what would become the largest tank battle in human history. Among them were the elite divisions of the Waffen-SS and the best panzer formations remaining to the Wehrmacht. But by 1943, the Red Army was no longer the confused, demoralized force that had collapsed in 1941. Under the leadership of commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning so thoroughly that they knew the details of Operation Citadel almost as well as the German High Command. The Kursk salient was transformed into the most formidable defensive position in military history. 8 successive defensive lines stretched back over 100 miles, protected by over 1 million mines, thousands of anti-tank guns, and carefully positioned reserves ready to counterattack any German breakthrough. More critically, Soviet industry was now producing weapons in quantities that dwarfed German output. For every German tank, the Soviets could field 3. For every German aircraft, the Red Air Force had 2. The industrial balance that had once favored Germany had shifted decisively eastward, aided by Lend-Lease supplies from the United States and Britain. The T-34, continually improved and upgraded, remained superior to most German armor. But now it was joined by new designs, the KV-1 heavy tank and the fearsome Stalin tank series that could match even the mighty Tiger in armored combat. July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began with the largest artillery barrage in military history, a thunderous crescendo of destruction that could be heard 100 miles away. German forces attacked from both north and south, attempting to pinch off the Kursk salient in a classic double envelopment. But instead of breakthrough, the Wehrmacht found prepared defenses and overwhelming numbers. The new Tigers and Panthers, technological marvels though they were, proved vulnerable to concentrated anti-tank fire and mines. More critically, mechanical reliability problems plagued the sophisticated new machines. Panthers broke down faster than Soviet shells could destroy them. July 12, 1943, at the village of Prokhorovka, the largest tank engagement in history erupted as over 1,500 armored vehicles clashed in a single devastating encounter. The battle raged for 12 hours across a front of just 15 miles, with tanks fighting at point-blank range in a mechanical gladiatorial contest that decided the fate of nations. When the smoke cleared, the German offensive was broken. The vaunted panzer divisions that had conquered half of Europe lay shattered in the Russian steppes. More significantly, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority to an increasingly confident Red Air Force equipped with modern fighters and piloted by veterans hardened by 2 years of combat. The failure of Operation Citadel marked the end of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Never again would the Wehrmacht launch a major attack against Soviet forces. From Kursk forward, the German army in Russia would be permanently on the defensive, fighting a series of desperate delaying actions as the Red Army advanced inexorably westward. The statistics of German defeat at Kursk were staggering. Over 200,000 casualties, nearly 700 tanks destroyed, and 1,400 aircraft lost. These were losses the shrinking Wehrmacht could not afford and could never replace. Following their victory at Kursk, Soviet forces began an advance that would not stop until Soviet tanks reached the heart of Berlin. Ukraine was systematically liberated, the 872-day siege of Leningrad was finally broken, and Germany's increasingly reluctant allies began abandoning the sinking Nazi ship. Romania switched sides in August 1944, followed by Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland. The Third Reich, which had controlled territory from the Atlantic to the Volga just 2 years earlier, was shrinking back toward its original borders as the Red Army liberated the conquered territories of Eastern Europe. January 1945, Soviet forces crossed into Germany itself, bringing the war home to the German people for the first time. The Red Army that had been dismissed as subhuman by Nazi ideology was now dictating terms in the heart of the Reich, supported by an industrial machine that was producing weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. The final irony of Operation Barbarossa was that it created the very outcome Hitler had sought to prevent. By attacking the Soviet Union, Germany had awakened a sleeping giant that would ultimately destroy the Nazi regime. The invasion designed to secure German dominance of Europe had instead ensured Soviet dominance of Eastern Europe for the next half-century. On May 9, 1945, Victory Day in the Soviet calendar, the war that began with German tanks rolling across the Soviet border ended with Soviet tanks in the ruins of Berlin. Adolf Hitler, the architect of Operation Barbarossa, had committed suicide in his bunker as Russian shells fell on the Reich Chancellery above him. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as Germany's path to empire, had become the road to ruin. Of the 4 million men who had crossed the Soviet border on that fateful morning in June 1941, the vast majority would never return home. They lay buried in the vastness of Russia, victims of their Führer's greatest miscalculation. The invasion that was meant to secure a 1,000-year empire instead ensured its destruction in just 4 years. Hitler's obsession with conquering the East, born from a toxic mixture of racial ideology and territorial greed, became the instrument of his own downfall and the doom of Nazi Germany. In the end, Operation Barbarossa failed not because of winter weather or strategic mistakes, though both played their part, but because it was based on fundamental misunderstandings about Soviet military capacity, Russian geography, and the will of the Soviet people to resist. Hitler's racial theories blinded him to reality, and reality ultimately won. The greatest invasion in human history had become the greatest catastrophe in German history. Operation Barbarossa, the campaign that was supposed to win the war, instead lost it, dooming the Third Reich to the dustbin of history.